Welcome. I'm Langdon Hammer. It is a late July morning. I'm at 107 Water Street, James Merrill's apartment, up on the 4th floor, and I'm going to have a conversation with his longtime friend, Stephen Yenser. Stephen.
Hello, Lanny.
I've just been talking with Sandy. And it occurs to me that Sandy always called Mr. Merrill Jimmy, and you always called him James. And it's a slightly different tone.
Yeah, I think he had a number of different names. I know some people who knew him when he was younger called him Jamie. I think that might be boarding school. I'm not sure. But yeah, I knew him as James. He gave me the choice, as I think he did Darrell Hine. I think we got to know each other about the same time. Darrell, the poetry editor of Poetry magazine and a poet in his own right, and he met James, I think, in Paris, not about the same time that I met James in Madison, perhaps a little earlier, and. I remember asking James how I should call him, and he said that either James or Jimmy is what people called him, and so I went with James. Jimmy just seemed to me impossible. He was, even at 40 years old, which he was then, he was too impressive, too dignified for me to think of as Jimmy. Jimmy meant a little kid to me, and while there was a lot of the little kid in James always, I just couldn't call him that. So for me, it was always James. And I think after that, then people who'd known him longer would call him Jimmy, and people who just got to know him after Darrell and I did, I think, tended to call him James. But I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, take us back to when you met, which would be you're entering a classroom in Madison, Wisconsin, and finding James Merrill at the head of the table.
Yes.
1967.
Yes, that's exactly the case. It was one of the few workshops that I think that James ever taught, and it was the only workshop like this that he ever taught in the Midwest, not attached to any of his universities where he had friends. And I'm not even sure what brought him out there. He wasn't happy. There weren't enough people that he knew. He needed more of a social friendly life than he had in Madison. And I think he was ready to get out of there by the time he left. And the workshop was not a poetry workshop, really, in the sense that we have these days. He wouldn't let us talk about our poems in class because he was afraid that we would embarrass ourselves. So if we wanted to talk about our poems, and of course we did, we would go around and see him in his office and talk to him there. And he was an excellent critic, but in class we talked about Elizabeth Bishop. I think Questions of Travel had just come out. And we talked about John Barrowman. He excerpted some of the most vivid parts of that altogether vivid poem. And we talked about them in depth in class. And Marianne Moore and a lot of other people, but not her own poems. The one exception I can think of is that he gave us a poem, a little lyric by Heine, a little song. It begins, Ich grolle nicht, and he asked us to translate it. He depended upon us to get our own ponies if we didn't have any German. And we did talk about those translations in class, but without the names. He gave us a number of translations that the class members had done, but he didn't put our names on them. And they were translations that were supposed to be able to be singable. Mine was not singable at all. Some people did a very good job, but that's the only time I ever saw any of my classmates' poems, although some of the people in that class went ahead to write very good poems. There was David Keller, who is still writing well, Judy Moffett, who has written both poems and science fiction. There was a guy named Antler. Now, Antler has become fairly well known, I think, as a latter-day beat, Whitmanian sort. His name was, what was his name?
I believe it was Antler.
Thank you.
One word, like a Brazilian football star.
That's right.
Yeah. Tell us about James Merrill as a teacher, as a presence in the classroom. What were your impressions?
I was awed.
Yeah.
He was only 40, as I say, and he looked much younger. Mm-hmm. So I was in my early 20s, and he looked like a peer. And I think he was sitting on the edge of a table when we came in. But he was immediately impressive because he had a wonderful voice, and he had a wonderful carriage, wonderful poise, and it was apparent right away that he had a lot of authority. I remember that he asked us fairly early on in the first class period, he said, does anybody have any poems that they would like to say? And nobody wanted to recite, or maybe nobody had any poems that they knew by heart that were distinctive enough, I don't know. And then he began to recite a poem by Edith Sitwell, a long poem by Sitwell. One of her very soundy poems, one that has lots of sonic effects and funny rhymes and so on. And he began, and he went on and on and on, and it must have taken 5 minutes before he stopped himself. And then we went on and did other things. No more was said about memorization. At the next class period, he asked again. He said, does anybody have any poems today they would like to say? And yes, indeed, hands shot up all over the room. Everybody had taken the lesson, and everybody had a poem, and some of them very difficult. So that he taught, I would say, by example mostly. And he was a wonderful teacher in that way.
Yeah, how did you get from being his student to being his friend?
We had him over for dinner, my wife and I, just before he left. I was too scared of him to invite him earlier. So we invited him the night before he left town, and for some reason he was free. He was free too much. That was his problem. So he came over, and I made all kinds of gaffes. I remember he liked, I asked him what he liked to drink, and he said he liked to drink old fashions, among other things, imagine. So I went out and got what I thought were the makings for the old fashioned, and gave him several drinks over the course of the evening. We had a great time, and he drank up, but I'd gotten scotch instead of bourbon, and so all evening I'd been giving him what I later found were Rob Roy's, rather than old fashioned. He never said a word, and I didn't know this until later. And he left a book for us after we'd sent him home that night. He came back and left an inscribed book for us on our doorstep, very characteristically thoughtful in that way, and the next day he was gone. And I missed him right away, and we went out of town, didn't hear from him, and I came back at the end of the summer then, and there was a postcard from him in my mailbox at the university. And it was several weeks old, but I wrote back to him immediately, and so then we began to correspond. And that is, in fact, how I knew him for the first several years. I didn't see very much of him. We wrote letters, and he was as I've said before, he's one of the last great letter writers, I suspect, now that we have email and social media.
Well, you probably have hundreds of them over the course of your friendship. Tell us about a James Merrill letter.
James Merrill letter could have anything in it, from descriptions of the most recent opera that he'd been to, or the paintings that he had seen in Arezzo or Venice, or indeed New York, or wherever he'd happened to be, and to gossip. And he had a very good ear for the found pun, for the unintentional pun, for the remark that he could turn two ways. And he loved to quote these things. And so he's a wonderful describer of social scenes as well as of aesthetic scenes. So anything might make its way into Merrill letter. They're very lively, and they're without transition. He wrote several a day, I've come to learn, and it's a great mystery how he ever had the energy to write that many letters, and to work as much as he did every day, and to have all the friends that he had. It took me. When I wrote to James, at first especially, I had to write everything out longhand and revise it, and then I would type it up and send it to him. But he typed fluently and wrote very quickly, and it was just a staggering performance. I got to see it closer at hand later. But he was a great letter writer. We're, as you know, along with you, I'm working, and Sandy, I'm working on an edition of the letters now, and it will be, I hope, a very interesting and large, handsome production.
You know, Stephen, the first time you and I ever sat down for a conversation about James Merrill, I actually remember a number of different details that you shared. One comment really stuck with me, and I've always kind of, it's always been on my mind as I've thought about Merrill. You said, you know, he was a bit of a graphomaniac, and you were talking about how he was always writing.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about James Merrill's graphomania.
Well, he had lots and lots of notebooks. He doted on notebooks. There was a particular kind of notebook that he especially loved from a shop in Venice called, I think, Piazzesi. Beautiful marbled covers, and he used those notebooks for writing, I think, at home and for recollecting a day's doings and so on. But he always had a pen and paper with him. I mean, he was a writer, so you have to be able to write at all times. And so he took notes on things, and he wrote very early in the morning when he got up, usually, seriously. Then he wrote letters during the day. You know more than most people do about the extent of his notebooks, and I think that they are probably multitudinous.
You described, in fact, in the talk you gave right here in this room a few days ago, you described James Merrill at home, in his house, writing, maybe copying down a recipe off the phone, making adjustments to a poem on the typewriter.
He was a multitasker, the first one I guess I ever knew. And he could, yes, I was in conversations with him where he would be talking to me and talking to somebody on the phone. And I recalled the other day a conversation in which he was speaking in French to one person and in Greek to another and in English to me. And the three conversations were different. And he was perfectly seamless in his transitions. And I think he loved that. And you can see it in his poems too. The longer poems have plots that intersect and ramify, like Ephraim and The Will and a number of other poems. And so it was one of those points at which I think his life and his art came together, as they tended always to do. His talk in a relaxed social situation sometimes often sounded like something he had written in a poem, and he would write in his poem something that he had just said, or might as well have said, rather, in a conversation. And so his polished poems and his informal talk came to resemble one another. His persona in the poems is very much like the persona, and I mean persona, that you got in person. The life and the art were more closely related for him than for anybody I've ever known, much more closely related. And his writing all the time was a way of getting from one to the other.
Staying with his writing for a moment as a topic, I mean, that is to say his actual practice, you were really the first reader of most of his work, certainly one of the first readers, but always one of his readers. And you were writing back to him about the poems he's sending you. I think, you're really uniquely able to describe his poetic process, how he got from that notebook jotting to the poem on the published page. Can you describe it for us?
Yes, but he never sent me the very raw drafts. I've been looking through a lot of his manuscripts lately because of a digital edition that the Poetry Foundation is working on. And I see that the poems can begin any place, and there's a phrase here and a phrase there, and he wrote all over a page. There was no orderly sequence.
Right.
He didn't date his drafts for the most part. He didn't number the pages. He would just start writing, and it could be it could be from any place in the final poem, and then things would accumulate, and then something would catch, and he would get big chunks of it out. But what he sent to me was almost always virtually finished, by which I mean he knew probably where he was going to end, and he had approximately the right number of lines. So what he and I did was talk about details endlessly, because there was no end for detail for him. I was always surprised that there are some exceptions to this, but for the most part, after he published a poem in a journal, he quit revising. And that didn't square with the rest of his personality, really, because when he was putting together a poem, he was an endless reviser. He just changed everything and changed it back and wrote it out again, and that's the kind of thing we talked about. He loved detail. We were both a little bit obsessive, I think. And so that's the kind of thing we often wrote about.
Yeah, what you're pointing out there is an interesting doubleness, one of many in him, between obsessive revision and then also a capacity to say, that's done, I'm moving on.
Yes. Yes, and he was a divided nature always, and yet you never really saw the divisions somehow. But it's true, there are many dualities in him, and he was able to revise endlessly and yet to move on. He, in some ways, he never moved on from a great deal. One thing about James is that he never left anything, I think, entirely in the past. I think this might have had something to do with his parents' divorce and the fact that something there had to be left in the past, his original home. But he never forgot friends. He never gave up friends. He stayed in touch with everybody. He had very close friends all at once. He had best friends all at once. He was my best friend after I got to know him for 20, 25 years. And I think I was like many people in that regard. James had many best friends. And it all came together in the poetry. He never left anything behind, so he's able to use it. He was very, very thrifty. Waste not, want not was one of his favorite sayings. And that was true in his social situations as well as in his writing. So he did move on. He was always moving. He was. I never understood how he got so much done when he traveled as much as he did.
Actually, let's talk about that too. James Merrill, the traveler. I have to say, in working on his life story, I've discovered that I don't think he was ever in one place for more than a few days. I mean, even if he was, say, in Stonington for even several months, he'd be coming and going constantly.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's remarkable. And yet he was, when he was at home in these places, he was really at home. I mean, he was set up. He had a study wherever he had set up his home, and he worked there. He was plugged in. So there was never any question what the center of his life was, and that was writing. He worked when I knew him, which was a long time, mostly in the morning. And his work was hardly ever visible. I mean, he hardly ever did anything in public, except the occasion when he'd write a note down or something by the side of a painting or something. But he worked alone in his study, but he worked every day. And but he traveled all the time, and it's quite a mystery to me how you can do that. It takes me days to get settled into a new place, but he would light and get to work and travel and have fun.
We are here on Water Street in Stonington. You knew his house in Athens.
Yes.
Describe his house in Athens for us.
Very like the house here in that it was layered. It had 3 stories plus a rooftop. And it had small rooms, as he has here. He liked small rooms. He liked to be confined in that way. He liked houses that had been lived in. It too was a house that he didn't do too much remodeling with. He and David, they took it more or less as it was, and then made use of the spaces that were there. It's kind of like receiving a stanza form, I think, the canzone or the pantoum or something. It's there, and then you do with it what you can. It was a social center on the evenings. On the weekends, lots of people came through town, and I don't know how they knew he was there. They all found it was really very like Gatsby. People found their way to James Merrill's house in Athens. Caroline Kennedy showed up one night, I remember, and just lots of well-known people I didn't know James knew, and maybe some of them he didn't know so well. He didn't know Caroline Kennedy well, but she turned up at the party, and this is the way it was. Sculptors, all kinds of scholars through the apartment in the evenings at his soiree. So it was a very lively house. It was had a very nice setting at the bottom of Mount Ligavitos. Not showy at all. This house is not showy, obviously. I mean, the ground floor is for commercial use. Second floor is for renters. the rest of the building for James and David. So it's very integrated with the village. And I think James did not like to stand out. When I first visited him the first time, he sent me a postcard of a grand house out in the country. And it's beautiful. It had Stonington on the postcard. It was an old postcard. And he'd put in, pen a little arrow toward a room at the top. And he said, this will be where you stay. I believed him. And I came here, and we came into town, and we drove down Water Street, and we came to this building. And until I got here, I had no idea. All along, he thought I knew he was kidding about this grand old mansion that belonged to somebody else, but I didn't. That's
what you were imagining.
Yeah.
Back to Athens before we...
Yes.
And actually back to writing.
Yes.
Describe his study there.
His study was a made-over laundry room on the top of the building. There was a terrace there, much like the deck here, and there was a very small laundry room where the maid would once have gone to wash the clothes. It was just big enough for a desk and a chair, and there was a fan in the room.
It must have been incredibly hot, actually.
It was very hot. It was very hot. It was on the top of the building, and this fan. Again, he worked in the morning when it tended to be cooler, but in Athens, especially in the summer, it's very, very hot. You would have thought that anybody would not be able to work in those conditions, but he could. He had somehow got all of Auden's Oxford English Dictionary, all 26 volumes of it, into the room. So when I would go there with him, I was there on a couple of occasions, we're looking at poems or something, there's barely enough room for us. It's a very, very small place. But he loved that. I remember I had a study that was once a whole room in a house, and he didn't understand why I needed the whole room. He said, why don't you just put a wall of books in here, and you can use the rest of this for something else. He liked smallness. He didn't enjoy the grand at all.
That's right. Yeah. And yet, in keeping with that double nature, he wrote a very grand poem.
What a great surprise.
Very, very long one. Yeah. Talk to us about Sandover.
Well, I think when it began, of course it began slowly. It began as the Book of Ephraim, the first part of the trilogy, and Ephraim is more a sequence of lyrics, perhaps. It's a kind of epyllion rather than an epic. It's in 26 sections, and there are several narratives that are broken up and spliced together. So it's a cross between a lyric poem, a set of lyric poems and a narrative. But what was odd about it, of course, was that he had speakers from the other world in the poem, speakers that he and David had contacted by way of the Ouija board, and they spoke. And David and James seemed more or less to believe in the truth of what they said. And so this was a surprise to many people who knew him as being very practical and down to earth. With the second part and the third part of the trilogy, as it was in Sandover, these characters became stranger and stranger and talked more and more and said more and more surprising things. And even his friends began to wonder whether this was good for James's career, good for his sensibility even. I think there were times when James wondered. I saw him once, he was talking about Ephraim fairly early on, and he was scared because he didn't, I see scared, that perhaps overstates. He was daunted. He really did not know what to make of the voices that he and David were taking down. And he wasn't sure where they were coming from. He didn't know how to account for it. And I could see, and I rarely saw him shaken, but this was a moment at which he let his guard down, and he really was.
How did you view it? And how did you talk about it together? It's as if it's a kind of fiction that you both entered into, or something else?
I think, well, I suspended my disbelief as much as I could. I always felt that anything I could do to facilitate James's writing, I should do. It seemed to me I knew immediately what a great poet he was, and so I went along with it as much as I could. After a while, I think I became to believe it as much or as little as he did. He was always a skeptic, a cynic, I should say, about that. And much of Mirabel, the second book, is given over to questioning the authenticity of these other voices. He was never wholly convinced, and after he had finished Sandover, I think he became perhaps even more dubious, though he didn't say too much about it later. And indeed, he wrote some later poems that drew upon the experience. Again, he never left anything behind. He brought it along with him. It was a part then of his life, that is to say of his career, that is to say of his poetry. So.
Let's think about his career, his life after he writes the trilogy. David buys a house in Key West, and they relocate, at least for a few months of the year, from Greece to Florida. You've spent a lot of time in Key West visiting.
A little bit.
Describe that world for us.
Yeah. I knew him much better in Greece, and I was only in Key West on a couple of occasions, actually. It seemed to me, though, that Key West was not all that different from Athens. There were characters in Athens that he knew, who were expat, many of them, and of course Key West has its own kind of expat, and there were poets who were still writing, some poets who were not writing anymore, and very colorful cast of characters. And it seemed to me that there was something of this raffish nature about some of the people that he knew in Key West too. And he, again, as here, where he has the house in layers, partly commercial, partly for renters, and partly for his family. His parties and his life was like that. People mingled from all strata, as they used to say. So I could have walked easily from the living room at Key West into onto the terrace at Athens, and we could have been in the same place, really.
You're in the same life.
Yes.
Yeah, very interesting.
And he knew this. I mean, he kept trying to find new lives. He loved to start again. That was hopeless, of course, because of his inability to get rid of the past. Not that he really wanted to, but he liked the idea of starting again, and he would go to Athens, he'd go to Key West, but pretty soon Athens became like Stonington, and then Key West became like Athens. He was cosmopolitan. He was at home wherever. The same people. The same various cast came to him. He was the whole world.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm beginning to make him sound, I think, without flaw or something, which may be the case. I don't know, but I'm a little bit leery of making him out to be a perfect and huge person, and yet I can't avoid that.
Well,
he was singular.
Complicate that portrait then.
Yeah.
What would be some
yeah.
crazing or
Yeah.
shadows on the picture?
Yeah, it's a good word, crazing. Well, he was very quick, and so he could be impatient with people. and especially if he knew you well. If you'd done something silly or thoughtless, he would point it out to you. And because he was generally very thoughtful and kind, those times would sting. He was usually able to make a joke out of it, though. I remember in Istanbul, we went to Istanbul from Greece. We went to a nice restaurant there that he had been wanting to go to for a long time, Regence it was called. We went, and very good meal indeed, and I spilled my wine. And the proprietor came and replaced the glass and poured me some more wine, and I spilled it again. And James was quite upset, but he managed to keep himself under control. I knew that he was very upset, but the proprietor didn't really. But the next morning, I wish I had it here, James gave me a book about the Turkish shadow theater, in which he had inscribed a verse that commemorated very wittily my escapade of the night before, my contretemps, and it was all over. He'd made a verse out of it, you know, and now it was funny and it could be put into a poem. But of course he should have been impatient with that. But he would get impatient with smaller things too. Yeah. And what he was doing tended to be the thing that he thought should probably be done. I mean, when he smoked, he didn't reproach others for smoking. When he quit smoking, he wanted everybody whom he knew well to quit smoking. If he had a couple of drinks in the evening, that was okay. That was just about right. That's what Auden used to have. But then if he quit drinking for a while, he began to think maybe drinking wasn't such a good idea for other people too. And so I don't know how much of that is like all of us.
Do you remember him getting angry with you?
Well, that's a very good question.
Or you getting angry with him?
Yeah, well, isn't that funny? I don't think I ever got angry with him. He must have got angry with me, but he never raised his voice with me. I'm sorry, I can't think of anything. I think I disappointed him on a couple of occasions. But I can't ever recall making him angry.
He speaks in his letters of viewing you as someone he wants to be on his best behavior for, perhaps. Perhaps you felt the same way.
Oh, you know, that I should be on my best behavior for him. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's interesting. I'd forgotten that he would have had that view of me. And it's kind of hard to account for. We had a lot of fun together. You remind me that he scrawled in an old yearbook of his across his picture in regard to something else that was in the yearbook. He said, for Stephen, he said, you and I always made each other laugh, didn't we? And it was true. He made me laugh as nobody ever has, and I could make him laugh too, and that was great.
Sitting over there on the bookshelf is a book about puns that you gave to James, and you've inscribed it to James, the Raja of the Punjab, or the Punjab.
Yes.
It seems to me like you had a lot of laughter over puns. Talk about this side of Merrill.
Well, he was verbally as quick as a dictionary, you know. And he loved puns, but he felt that he overindulged. And when I began to imitate him in this regard, he saw it immediately and he cautioned me against it and said that I mustn't be infected by the same virus I was, and there was nothing I could do about it by then. But I think for him, the way he understood language had to do with the way he understood the world. And so that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was a pun, I think, was the way he felt. And so, and he wanted always to see two sides of a matter, which is one reason why he could never be political. He was never a man for parties or cults or political parties or cults or anything like that. So he wanted to see all facets of a thing or a concept. And this has to do, I think, with his understanding of words and how complicated words are and how much of a past they have and how much they bring with them. And so I think his way with language was his way with the world.
And it was comedic.
Yes.
And full of fun and pranks.
Yes. Yes. He for a while there was a period of about 5 or 10 years in which his mantra was light. Keep it light. And I think he and his friend Maria Mitsotakis in Greece shared this mantra. They both like to keep things light. Stay on the surface, he would say. And of course his poems are full of wonderful, beautiful, scintillating surfaces. But they've also got a lot of depth, those poems. A lot of depth, much more depth than any of his contemporaries. And, but that was something you did not see very much of in James at the dinner table or even at the coffee table. That was between him and the work mostly. And the darker sides of an incident, those he would write about rather than talk about. And complications he saved for later. I don't think he wanted, again, he didn't want to embarrass students in his class about their poems, and he didn't want to cause an awkward moment in a conversation. He believed in manners, and he wanted to keep an unruffled surface as much as possible. So you never saw him break down. You could see him laugh uproariously, but he never got overly sad, and you never saw him particularly bewildered, even. If he was going to get bewildered, he would take that apart and think about it later. So he was, as I say, awed by the spirits, Ephraim and the others, but you didn't see much of that except on, I'd say, that one occasion.
Yeah. Since you mentioned it, do you recall him crying?
Yes. Once. The only time I ever saw James cry was after the death of his good friend, David Calstone. James had been abroad in Japan, I think, when David died, and David was ill. And James knew when he left the country that David was ill. And he knew there was a possibility that David wouldn't be alive when he came back. And so he came back, and David indeed had died. And we were in a car in California just riding someplace, and he was with a friend, and they were talking about David, and James suddenly burst into tears. And I think he felt terrible about not having been here for David. I think maybe he felt guilty. Maybe he felt that he should not have traveled, that he should have stayed here. I don't know. But it was the one time I ever saw him cry, and it was uncontrollable for about 5 minutes.
That would be probably May 1986.
Okay. And David was, what, 53 years old?
Yeah. David actually died shortly after that. He died in June, and Jimmy did see him again, but only to actually see him, not that they couldn't converse and so on and so forth.
So he saw him after that experience in the car.
Right.
See, you know his life so well. And I had, in my memory, I had moved it to...
Yeah. The other thing I'm thinking about, as you describe that, is 2 months before, Merrill had his own HIV diagnosis. So he knew that he was infected with the virus at that stage. Can you talk about this phase of your friend's life? Did he, how did he speak of his own or not speak of his own diagnosis with you?
The latter. He didn't speak of it with most people. At first, I think he spoke of it with nobody except the people who had to know. I didn't know for a long time, and I was a little hurt that I hadn't known somehow. I shouldn't have been at all, of course, but I think that, well, he was, I think, thoughtful first of his mother. I don't think he wanted his mother to know about it. And I heard from people who knew him, in a way I shouldn't have heard, really kind of third, fourth hand suspicions. And so I called him immediately and said, "What is the story here?" And he said, yes. He said, "It's true." But I think it was because of his mother. He didn't want it to get out, and of course it did. So we didn't talk very much about it, he and I. And I wish that we had more. Had I been, we didn't live in the same place ever for very long. Had I been in this area, maybe we would have talked about it more. I don't know. Sandy McClatchy was a great help to him, I know.
He was just about to visit you, actually, before he died.
Yeah, he was in Tucson, and I had talked to him on the telephone not too long before, probably a couple of days. Everybody claimed to have the last conversation with James Merrill. I don't know if you've come across this in your research, but I've heard any number of people say, "Oh, I talked to him late that night." Well, I too talked to him at least a day or two before. And we had a reading set up at UCLA. I think he was looking forward to it. He was a little frail, I knew that. But he was eager on the phone, as he always was. What's the Herbert phrase? New, tender, quick in love unknown, that he lived with. He wanted always to be new, tender, quick. He wanted always to give that impression. Indeed, he wanted, that's the way he wanted his feelings to be. And when they weren't that way, that started a lot of poems. In fact, his sense that he was cold. Surprising number of poems start with a cold man, or somebody with a partial paralysis, to take another poem, or if he's projecting onto someone else, as he is in Friend of the Fourth Decade, somebody who is absolutely awash in Baudelarian ennui, without feeling. And that was James's idea of hell, I think, to not to feel and somehow to feel that you didn't feel. I think poetry was, I mean, that kept him feeling. It's one reason why he was so addicted to it. But how did I get here?
Well, we were talking about the last phase
of
his life.
Yes.
How do you suppose his diagnosis and his daily struggle with AIDS entered the work?
It gave him some great poems. The poems of the last 10 years. A lot of them allude to AIDS or to dying. I don't know that he ever thought he was on the very brink of death, but And I think his death was a surprise. I mean, he was coming to, in a couple of weeks, to Los Angeles. It wasn't a long illness in that sense. But he was very aware those last 10 years of dying, and a lot of the poems get their power, I think, from that awareness.
Mm-hmm. You have an example in mind?
I do. And if we're to the point where I might read a poem,
yes,
then I would, I'll read a poem called Christmas Tree, which a lot of people know, I think, by now. And if they don't, they should. This is a poem called Christmas Tree, and it's on a page. It's set on a page as though the Christmas tree were cut off by a door jamb, as though the poet were in the next room, the waiting room, maybe from the Christmas tree. It was left after his death. And was subsequently published. So the star on the top of the tree, the tip of the tree, is just two words, and I'll start this. So, Christmas tree. To be brought down at last from the cold, sighing mountain where I and the others had been fed, looked after, kept still, meant, I knew, of course I knew, that it would be only a matter of weeks, that there was nothing more to do. Warmly they took me in, made much of me. The point from the start was to keep my spirits up. I could assent to that. For honestly, it did help to be wound in jewels, to send their colors flashing forth from vents in the deep, fragrant sables that cloaked me head to foot. Over me then they wove a spell of shining, purple and silver chains, eavesdripping, tinsel, amulets, milagros, software of silver, a heart, a little girl, a Model T, two staring eyes. The angels, trumpets, bud and bee, the children's names, in clown-like capitals. Somewhere a music box whose tiny song played and replayed, I ended before long by loving. And in shadow behind me, a primitive IV to keep the show going. Yes, yes, what lay ahead was clear. The stripping, the cold street, my chemicals plowed back into the earth for lives to come. No doubt a blessing, a harvest, but one that doesn't bear, now or ever, dwelling upon. To have grown so thin, needles and bone, the little boy's hands meeting about my spine, the mother's voice, holding up wonderfully, no dread, no bitterness, the end beginning. Today's dusk room aglow for the last time with candlelight, faces love lit, gifts underfoot, still to be so poised, so receptive, still to recall, to praise. And he's thinking of Herbert there, I think, in those last lines, and praise him to the full, Herbert says.
Herbert, who himself created shape poems.
Yes, that's right, exactly. And that's James in the mode maybe of Yeats in, at the end of Lapis Lazuli. That,
a few weeks left was in fact the case.
Yes.
When he wrote that, and perhaps some knowledge, some partial knowledge of that as part of the poem.
Yeah, that IV of the electric cord that runs to the Christmas tree is
and the
telling adumbration.
The poem has a boy and his mother in it.
His mother outlived him, of course.
Yeah.
Holding up wonderfully. Yeah. The boy was very important to James. I mean, he kept the boy alive in him, and unlike Lowell, but anyway, so it's good that the boy comes back here in the poem, puts his arms around the Christmas tree.
Well, thank you. I think we've.
Thank you.
I think we've come to a good stopping point.
Thank you very much, Lanny.